Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting stuck into a really complex, high-stakes question. Can Ethiopia legally reclaim the port of Assab from Eritrea? I mean, this is where national identity, economic survival, and hard international law all collide. You've got Ethiopia, this huge, powerful country needing sea access desperately for its economy. And then there's Eritrea, obviously defending its territorial sovereignty. That's fundamental. So our mission today is to kind of cut through all the emotion, the historical narratives, and give you a clear, quick grasp of the, legal facts on the ground. We've looked at the key treaties, the UN rules that govern this.
And yeah, we can pretty much state the conclusion right at the start. Based on those sources, international law offers, zero unilateral legal path for Ethiopia to just take back sovereignty over Assab. That door is legally closed. So this deep dive is really about why that's the case, despite historical usage and maybe, more importantly, what options, realistic options are actually still on the table.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that because I think a lot of people, maybe looking way back in history, just assume Ethiopia always had this coastline. But the current situation, being landlocked, that's actually quite modern, isn't it? How did that happen?
Yeah, the absolute defining moment was Eritrean independence back in 1993. Before then, yes, Assab was definitely Ethiopia's main port, its gateway, but Eritrea's process of self-determination, which crucially was accepted and facilitated under the UN framework, it completely redrew the map. When Eritrea became a sovereign state, its borders, including that entire Red Sea coast, gained international recognition.
Right.
And the critical legal point here, this wasn't some sudden grab. Ethiopia formally recognized Eritrea's independence. And in doing that, they also recognized the internationally accepted borders of that new nation. And those borders unequivocally included Assab and Massawa.
Right.
So that act of recognition back in 93, that's really the first huge legal barrier to any claim Ethiopia might make today about owning Assab.
So that recognition really sets the legal foundation, defining those initial borders. But okay, this is where it gets even more tangled, because that recognition, it didn't stop that awful border war just a few years later, did it? How did sorting that out end up cementing Eritrea's claim even further, like closing the door completely?
Right, that brings us to the year 2000 and the Algiers Agreement. This was the peace deal brokered to end that really destructive war. And the key legal step here was creating a specific body, a mechanism to formally and permanently define the border. That was the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission, the EEBC.
EEBC, right.
And the legal power of this agreement is just immense because both Ethiopia and Eritrea explicitly agree beforehand that whatever the EEBC decided about their shared border would be final and binding.
Wow. Okay.
They basically signed away their right to argue about the outcome before the ruling even came out.
That sounds incredibly definite. Final and binding.
Yeah.
But I've got a question, and I bet many listening do too. What exactly did the EEBC do? And maybe explain the difference between delimitation and demarcation. Because those words sound really technical, but they seem central here.
That's a great point. They really are key. So delimitation comes first. That's the legal process. It's about defining the boundary line using treaties, maps, old documents, and putting it into words and map coordinates.
Yeah.
The EEBC did this in 2002, and their conclusion. Assab was located well inside Eritrean sovereign territory, no question.
Right.
Demarcation is the next step. That's the physical part, actually going out and marking that defined line on the ground with pillars or posts or whatever. And that's exactly where the politics really ran into the law, didn't it?
Right.
Because while that 2002 delimitation decision was legally rock solid and binding, Ethiopia then refused for many, many years to accept the physical demarcation, the marking of the line on the ground. They basically stalled the whole implementation process.
So you have the situation where politically, Ethiopia just wouldn't accept the final step, the physical marking. Does that refusal, or the decade-plus delay in finally accepting it, does that legally weaken or invalidate the original 2002 ruling from the EEBC?
No, absolutely not. Legally speaking, that Boundary Commission ruling was final the moment it was issued in 2002.
Yeah.
Full stop. Ethiopia signed the Algiers Agreement. They bound themselves to the outcome, whether they liked the map it drew or not. Refusing to demarcate, that was a failure to implement the ruling, yes, a political problem. But it didn't change the legal validity of the border definition itself. The question of who had sovereignty over Assab was settled then, legally, and it remains settled.
Okay, so we've got the initial recognition in 93, then this binding arbitration decision in 2002. So if all those established legal routes are blocked, history shows us that sometimes states consider, other means.
Yeah.
What's the legal hard line on using force in a situation like this?
Yeah, and this is really non-negotiable in modern international law. We're talking about the absolute core principle, the prohibition on the use of force. It's right there in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter. And this isn't some obscure clause. It's the fundamental rule set up after World War II, precisely to stop states from attacking each other.
Okay.
Article 2.4 strictly forbids all UN member states, and both Ethiopia and Eritrea are members, from using force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state. So if Ethiopia were to try and occupy or annex Assab unilaterally, well, under international law, that's textbook aggression.
And connecting that dot, the consequences would be pretty severe, wouldn't they?
Mm.
Immediate international condemnation, probably sanctions, maybe even authorized by the UN Security Council. Sovereignty just can't change hands through force in today's legal system. That principle's ironclad, backed up by things like the Declaration on Friendly Relations, too.
Exactly. Non-negotiable.
Okay, that definitely rules out military options. But let me throw in a listener-type question here, something I could see someone asking. Things change, right? The political situation, Ethiopia's economic needs, they're drastically different now than in 2000. Couldn't Ethiopia argue rebus sic stantibus? You know, that doctrine about a fundamental change of circumstances to try and reopen the whole Algiers Agreement.
That's a really sharp legal question, actually. And it gets to the heart of the frustration a country might feel when locked into an old treaty. But the thing is, that doctrine, rebus sic stantibus, it's deliberately made very, very difficult to use successfully. And our sources are clear. It almost never applies to treaties that establish boundaries.
Okay, so it's a special case for borders.
Precisely. Once a border is delimited and agreed upon, even if one side protests later, it creates a permanent territorial status. The International Law Commission actually specifically wrote this limitation into the rules. Think about it. If states could just say, oh, circumstances change, our economy needs this land now to undo border treaties, well, it would destabilize pretty much every border on the planet. Chaos. So no, that legal argument is also a dead end here.
Right, so the binding treaty holds firm against that challenge, too.
Ugh.
Okay, what about the big one, the World Court? Could Ethiopia take Eritrea to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, and argue maybe historical need or fundamental fairness?
That path looks blocked too, unfortunately. For two main reasons, really. First, the ICJ only gets involved if both countries agree to let the court decide. It's based on consent. And Eritrea has shown absolutely zero interest in reopening the sovereignty question in court.
Okay, so voluntary jurisdiction.
Exactly. And second, even if hypothetically they both ended up at the ICJ, maybe through some highly unlikely Security Council referral, the court is bound by law, it would almost certainly look at the 2000 Algiers Agreement, see that it was final and binding, see the EEBC decision, and uphold it. The ICJ can't just ignore a valid final treaty settlement because one side wishes things were different. Legally, the territory question is done.
Wow. Okay, the legal walls around reclaiming sovereignty seem, well, they seem pretty solid. Built of steel, as you said earlier. Through courts, through force, by challenging the treaty, none seem viable.
So this brings us to maybe the crucial shift in thinking. What does international law say about Ethiopia's undeniable legitimate interest as a massive landlocked nation? They still need port access for their economy to function, to thrive.
And this is where the conversation needs to go, really.
Yeah.
This is the only constructive path forward. It's about shifting the focus entirely away from ownership of Assab towards usage of Assab. International law absolutely recognizes that landlocked states are in a uniquely vulnerable position, and it grants them specific rights to access the sea. Okay, rights to access.
Yes, and this is mainly laid out in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea on CLOS. You need to look at Part 10, Articles 124 to 132 specifically. These guarantee landlocked states the right of access to and from the sea, and also freedom of transit through the territory of coastal states, which in this case is Eritrea.
Freedom of transit. Okay, that sounds promising. It's like you don't own the supermarket, but maybe you get a guaranteed key card for the loading dock, right? But what does freedom of transit actually mean in practice? Can Ethiopia just send its trucks or trains across Eritrea with no strings attached?
And that's the catch, isn't it? It's the nuance that pushes this entire issue right back into the realm of diplomacy and hard negotiation. Incolorus grants the right to negotiate access, yes. But, and this is critical, these rights have to be exercised based on mutual agreement with the coastal state, Eritrea in this case.
Mutual agreement. Okay.
Yeah. So freedom of transit doesn't mean a free-for-all. It doesn't mean freedom from Eritrean regulations or port fees or security checks. The negotiations required are incredibly complex. You have to hammer out detailed agreements on using infrastructure, roads, railways, maybe pipelines. Who builds them? Who maintains them? Who pays for security along the corridor?
Right.
And then critically, what about the port itself? The tariffs, the fees for loading, unloading, storage, using the terminal facilities, all of that has to be agreed upon.
And when you consider the difficult political history between Ethiopia and Eritrea, getting that kind of detailed, secure, long-term mutual agreement sounds like a huge challenge. It sounds fragile. What kind of specific lawful arrangements are out there internationally that could actually work?
Yeah.
Something that meets Ethiopia's economic needs but absolutely respects Eritrea's sovereignty over Assab.
Well, the models that work elsewhere often involve quite creative economic solutions. Think less about territory, more about contracts. For instance, Ethiopia could negotiate a long-term lease or a concession for a specific defined terminal area within the port of Assab. They might get administrative control over just that logistics hub, maybe for 50 years or even 99 years. Eritrea keeps sovereignty over the land and water, but Ethiopia gets guaranteed operational space.
Like a dedicated zone within the port.
Exactly. Or they could negotiate a special economic zone status for Ethiopian goods transiting through Assab, meaning faster customs, fewer bureaucratic hurdles. Another option is a joint development agreement. Maybe both countries invest in upgrading the port and then share the profits from its operation. These kind of deals are pretty standard internationally. They manage to turn what could be a flashpoint, a source of conflict, into a source of shared economic benefit.
And surely the wider regional organizations have a role to play here too. It can't just be bilateral, can it?
Absolutely. Relying solely on a direct treaty between just the two countries can be risky, especially if political relations turn sour again down the line. So bringing in multilateral bodies like IG-80, that's the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, or using the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, that can add layers of stability. If you embed these access agreements within a broader regional economic structure, both sides get external guarantees, maybe mechanisms for resolving disputes. It makes the whole arrangement much more robust, less vulnerable to just bilateral political shifts.
That really pulls together the legal constraints and the diplomatic possibilities. So to bring it all back, the key takeaway for you, our listener, seems crystal clear. Based on international law, Ethiopia has no viable legal path to unilaterally reclaim sovereignty over the port of Assab. That door was firmly shut by the recognition in 1993 and then essentially bolted by the Algiers Agreement in 2000.
Correct. The only realistic lawful path forward is through diplomacy, through negotiation, through finding mutual consent. And the focus has to be on securing long-term, stable access rights, not ownership. It really requires a fundamental shift in thinking away from the zero-sum legal fight over territory towards building a practical, mutually beneficial economic partnership that serves both countries' interests.
Right. And maybe here's a final thought, something provocative for you to chew on. For decades, the Red Sea has often been seen as a zone of rivalry. What if it could be transformed? How might reframing it as a corridor of economic partnership and mutual benefit fundamentally change the long-term political calculations for both Ethiopia and Eritrea? If the economic success of both nations starts to depend equally on the smooth, efficient, stable flow of trade through Assab, does the question of who technically owns the land become less explosive than the shared need to ensure prosperity from the access? Something complex to consider.